The sound of a power sword activating in a silent chamber cuts through centuries of dust and memory. A single blade, igniting not on a battlefield, but in a room where a son looked at his father and made a choice that would drown the galaxy in fire. The bolter round being chambered echoes in the dark, a metallic whisper that preceded the screaming of billions. These sounds haunt the Imperium still, 10,000 years later, because they mark the moment when everything humanity built began to crumble. But here is the question that gnaws at the foundations of Imperial history like rust through ceramite. Was it ever really a choice at all? Brother Lexicanium Hadrian of the Ultramarines chapter stands before the Vault of Remembrance on Macragge, his gauntleted hand resting on ancient parchment sealed in stasis fields older than the current age. He is a librarian, a keeper of lore, and he has spent 3 centuries studying the fragments of the Great Betrayal. The vaults smell of age and preservation oils, of the chemical tang of stasis technology fighting entropy. The air tastes of filtered atmosphere, recycled through systems that have breathed the same molecules since before the heresy tore the Imperium in half. He reads the accounts, the fragmentary transmissions, the last words of loyal sons and traitorous brothers alike. Every record screams the same question into the silence. Could it have gone any other way? The chronicles tell the story we all know. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, brightest of the Emperor's sons, turned to chaos on the plague moon of Davin. The galaxy burned. Legions clashed. Brother slew brother in the most catastrophic civil war the Imperium has ever known. The Emperor was crippled, entombed on the Golden Throne, and 10,000 years of stagnation and suffering followed. We know the heroes. We know the villains. We know the battles and the betrayals. But Hadrian is not here for battle chronicles today. The records surrounding him contain something deeper, something that few imperial citizens are permitted to see. These archives hold the uncomfortable truth that the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Ecclesiarchy would prefer remain sealed. Here, in fragments of conversation between Primarchs, in the journal entries of remembrancers who witnessed the Great Crusade, in the sealed testimony of custodians who stood at the Emperor's side, lies evidence of a darker possibility. Not that the heresy happened, but that it had to happen. That betrayal was not an aberration, but the inevitable failure of a project built on lies, executed by a distant tyrant, using weapons too flawed to ever remain loyal. Hadrian's eyes, gene-enhanced to parse data at inhuman speeds, scan a particular passage. It is from the personal log of remembrancer Solomon Voss, who traveled with the Luna Wolves before they became the Sons of Horus. The entry is dated 3 years before Davin, before the corruption, before the fall. Voss writes about a conversation he overheard between 2 of Horus's captains, both now dead, their names expunged from imperial record. They spoke about the Imperial Truth, the Emperor's grand vision of a rational, secular galaxy free from superstition and religion. One captain said, "We are the lie the Emperor tells. Look at us. We are myths made flesh, and we crusade in his name like prophets of old Terra. How can he demand atheism while creating gods?" The other responded, "Do not question. The Emperor's vision is absolute." The first captain laughed bitter and cold. "Absolute. Yes, that is what concerns me." Hadrian closes the document, his fingers trembling slightly within his power armor. The conversation is heretical by current imperial standards, yet it was spoken by loyal sons of the Emperor, years before corruption touched them. The question they posed was not born of chaos. It was born of observation, of living within the contradiction that formed the bedrock of the Great Crusade itself, to understand whether the heresy was inevitable. Hadrian knows he must examine the 3 fundamental flaws that made the Imperium's foundation unstable from the moment it was laid. The first is the flaw in the design itself, the philosophical contradiction that poisoned the Imperial Truth from within. The second is the flaw in the Father, the Emperor's methods and choices that created the conditions for rebellion. The third is the flaw in the family, the nature of the Primarchs themselves, beings so fundamentally damaged and dangerous that catastrophic failure was written into their genetic code. These are not comfortable truths. The Ordo Hereticus would brand such inquiry as dangerous, possibly seditious. But Hadrian is not questioning the emperor's divinity, a concept that would have horrified the master of mankind during his mortal reign. He is analyzing history, seeking pattern and causation in the galaxy's greatest tragedy. If the Imperium is to endure another 10,000 years, it must understand what broke it the first time. The first flaw runs deeper than strategy or tactics. It is ideological, woven into the very fabric of what the emperor tried to build. The Imperial Truth, the grand philosophy that was supposed to unite humanity under reason and science, was a foundation built on sand and lies. Hadrian accesses another archive, this one containing fragments of the emperor's own speeches, recorded during the early days of the Great Crusade. The master of mankind, standing before the assembled war hosts of Terra, declared that humanity would cast off the shackles of superstition. There were no gods, he proclaimed. The warp was merely a dimension of energy and psychic phenomena, dangerous but ultimately comprehensible through science. Religion was the poison that had kept humanity divided and weak during Old Night. The new Imperium would be rational, atheistic, and united under empirical truth. It sounds noble. It sounds like enlightenment after millennia of darkness. But here is the contradiction that poisoned everything. The emperor created demigods to spread this message. He engineered 20 superhuman sons, each a legend incarnate, and scattered them across the galaxy through means that even he could not fully explain. Warp storms, daemonic intervention, cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension. The very birth of the Primarchs contradicted the rational universe the emperor claimed to champion. Then, he created the Space Marine legions, transhuman warriors who venerated their Primarchs with religious devotion. The emperor himself was worshipped as a god by countless worlds during the Great Crusade. Despite his protestations, he rode into battle on golden vessels that dwarfed planets, wielding power that seemed divine to every mortal who witnessed it. The imagery, the pageantry, the myths that grew around the legions and their Primarchs, all of it was fundamentally religious in nature. Hadrian finds a recording from a conquered world, brought into compliance during the Crusade's 2nd century. The planetary governor, kneeling before representatives of the Imperium, speaks of his conversion to the Imperial Truth. But his language betrays him at every turn. He speaks of the emperor's holy vision and the sacred duty of unity. He refers to the Space Marines as angels of deliverance and describes the Great Crusade as a divine mission. The imperial iterators stationed on the world tried to correct this language, to enforce proper secular terminology, but the governor could not separate the reality of what he witnessed from the religious framework burned into human consciousness by millennia of faith. This was the pattern everywhere. Humanity needed myths. Humans needed something greater than themselves to believe in, to fight for, to die for. The emperor gave them exactly that, while simultaneously demanding they acknowledge none of it as divine or supernatural. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but the greater lie, the one that made betrayal inevitable, was the denial of chaos itself. Hadrian pulls up classified archives that few outside the Inquisition are permitted to access. These are the sealed reports from the latter years of the Great Crusade, when certain Primarchs began encountering phenomena that the Imperial Truth could not explain. Worlds corrupted by entities that were demonstrably more than warp energy. Daemons, gods, the chaos powers that the emperor knew existed, but refused to acknowledge to his sons. The emperor's reasoning is documented in a conversation recorded by Constantin Valdor, the captain general of the Adeptus Custodes. The emperor explained that knowledge of chaos was dangerous, that awareness of the dark gods gave them power. Therefore, the Primarchs and the legions would be kept ignorant, told only that the warp was a dangerous but manageable dimension of energy, and hostile Xenos entities. This was, by any measure, a catastrophic failure of leadership. Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Word-Bearers, was perhaps the first to truly break under this contradiction. He was a being literally designed to believe, to worship, to find meaning in something greater than conquest. His genetic code sang with the need for faith. When the Emperor crushed Lorgar's worship of him at Monarchia, burning a city of the faithful, and forcing the Word-Bearers to kneel in the ashes, the Emperor removed the object of Lorgar's devotion, but could not remove the need to devote itself. Nature abhors a vacuum. So does faith. Hadrian reads Lorgar's own words, written in the Primarchs' journal after Monarchia. My father denies his divinity while wielding the power of gods. He forbids faith while demanding absolute obedience that can only be called worship. He claims there are no gods while keeping from us the truth of the powers that writhe in the warp, hungry and real and reaching for us with every psychic scream. He has created us to need purpose, then tells us our purpose is a lie. What does he expect us to do with this emptiness he has carved into our souls? It is heresy now, this writing. But before Chios claimed him, Lorgar asked the questions that the Imperial Truth made inevitable. When he turned to Chios, when he found entities that openly claimed godhood and welcomed his worship, was that betrayal? Or was it the logical conclusion of a man engineered to worship, denied the object of his devotion, and never told the truth about the alternatives? The pattern repeats with devastating consistency. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, was a psychic prodigy whose entire being resonated with the warp. The Emperor forbade sorcery, branded it dangerous and heretical, yet he himself wielded psychic power that dwarfed anything Magnus could achieve. The contradiction was maddening. Magnus sought to understand the warp, to master it through knowledge, because that was what he was designed to do. He was a scholar, a seeker of truth in a universe where his father insisted the greatest truths remain hidden. When Magnus discovered the conspiracy against the Emperor, when he tried to warn his father of Horus's corruption, he used the very sorcery the Emperor had forbidden. He breached the Webway Project's defenses, destroyed millennia of the Emperor's most secret work, all in an attempt to save his father from a betrayal Magnus could see unfolding. The Emperor punished him for it, condemned him without trial, sent the Space Wolves to burn Prospero and destroy the Thousand Suns. Hadrian finds the last transmission from Prospero, sent by a Thousand Suns sorcerer in the final hours before the world burned. The voice is broken, crackling with static and psychic interference. We tried to warn him. We tried to save him. And for our loyalty, he sends the wolves to our door. He created us to seek knowledge, then punishes us for learning what he refused to teach. There is no rationality in this. There is only hypocrisy and lies. If this is the Imperial Truth, then truth itself is a weapon turned against us. The transmission ends in screaming and the roar of flames. The Imperial Truth demanded a rational, secular galaxy, but it was enforced through mythic violence by demigod sons leading armies of transhuman warriors who were venerated as angels and heroes. It denied the existence of chaos while conducting a galaxy-spanning crusade through the warp. It promised enlightenment while maintaining the most catastrophic secret in human history. The foundation was rotten. The structure was unstable. Betrayal was not a possibility. It was the pre-ordained failure point of a philosophy that contradicted its own existence. Hadrian closes the archives on the Imperial Truth and feels the weight of what he has learned settle on his shoulders like lead. The Emperor built his dream on lies, and lies always collapse eventually. The only question was when, and who would be crushed when they fell. But the flaw in the design is only one piece of the puzzle. The second flaw is more personal, more damning. It is the flaw in the Father himself. The Emperor of mankind was many things: a visionary, a tyrant, a genetic architect, a warrior without equal. But as Hadrian examines the historical records with the cold precision of a librarian trained to see patterns in data, one truth becomes unavoidable as a manager of people. As a leader of sons, the emperor was catastrophically, perhaps deliberately, incompetent. Consider the evidence. The emperor created 20 Primarchs, each a fragment of his own essence given form and purpose. They were his sons, not merely biologically but fundamentally. He designed them. He built them. He knew every aspect of their genetic code, their psychological profiles, their strengths and weaknesses. Then he lost them to the warp, scattered across the galaxy by forces he claimed did not exist. When he found them again, one by one, he treated them not as sons but as tools, as weapons to be deployed, assets to be managed, generals to be given orders and expected to obey without question or explanation. Hadrian finds a report from a remembrancer attached to the emperor's personal fleet during the Great Crusade's height. The remembrancer, a woman named Cyrene Valantian, documented a conversation she witnessed between the emperor and Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines. Guilliman had requested a private audience to discuss the long-term governance structure of the Imperium, seeking clarification on how the conquered worlds would be administered once the crusade ended. The emperor's response, as Cyrene recorded it, was brief and cold. "You will have your answers when I deem you require them. Until then, conquer. Bring compliance. Trust that I know what is necessary." Guilliman, ever loyal, accepted this dismissal. But Cyrene noted in her private journal that she saw something in the Primarch's eyes she had never seen before. Frustration, perhaps even hurt. This pattern of secrecy and distance characterized almost every interaction between the emperor and his son. He withheld critical information, demanded absolute trust while offering none in return, and treated questions as challenges to his authority, rather than opportunities to build understanding. The Webway project is the clearest example of this failure. The emperor retreated to Terra in the Great Crusade's final years, leaving Horus as War Master to lead the remaining campaigns. He told no one, not even Horus, what he was doing. The Primarchs knew only that their father had abandoned the crusade for some secret work beneath the imperial palace. They knew he had declared it more important than the galaxy-spanning war of conquest they were still fighting. But he refused to explain why. Hadrian accesses the sealed testimony of a custodian who served during this period, a guardian named Aquilon who was assigned to the Webway project's defense. His account is clinical, precise, the observations of a warrior bred for perfect recall. The emperor worked in silence, his focus absolute. When Rogel Dorn came to Terra seeking audience, requesting to know the nature of the work that had taken the emperor from the crusade, the emperor dismissed him with no explanation. I witnessed Lord Dorn leave the chamber, his face a mask of controlled emotion. But I have stood guard over warriors for centuries. I know the signs of pain. The Primarch felt abandoned. He felt trusted less than a simple weapon or a servitor, for even they are told the purpose they serve. The emperor's secrecy extended beyond the Webway. He never told his sons about chaos, never warned them of the dangers lurking in the warp, beyond simple hostile entities. When Primarchs encountered demonic corruption or witnessed phenomena that contradicted the Imperial Truth, they had no framework to understand it, no knowledge to defend themselves. They were sent into battle against an enemy they did not know existed, with no armor against corruption except ignorance. This was not protection. This was negligence bordering on sabotage. Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, was perhaps the clearest victim of the Emperor's failure as a father. Perturabo was a genius of siege warfare and engineering, a mind capable of calculating trajectories and stress points with superhuman precision. But he was also deeply damaged, plagued by an inferiority complex that gnawed at him constantly, driven by a need for recognition that was never satisfied. The Emperor used Perturabo mercilessly. Every brutal siege, every grinding campaign where glory was impossible and losses were guaranteed, the Iron Warriors were deployed. Perturabo begged for acknowledgement, for appreciation of the thankless work his legion performed, while others like Horus and Sanguinius won glory in glorious campaigns. The emperor gave him nothing. More orders, more sieges, more grinding attrition. Hadrian finds a transmission per Turabo sent to the emperor after the compliance of Crade. The Iron Warriors had suffered 87% casualties, reducing a fortress world that could have been negotiated into surrender. Perturabo's message is formal, militarily precise, but there is desperation bleeding through the formal language. My lord and father, the Crade compliance is complete. Total Iron Warriors casualties stand at 312,409 legionaries. We request resupply and a period of rebuilding. Additionally, I humbly submit my strategic analysis of the campaign and recommendations for future siege doctrines. I await your assessment and guidance. The Emperor's response, transmitted 6 weeks later, contained 2 sentences. Compliance noted. Proceed to the Olympian sector for next deployment orders. No acknowledgement of the losses. No review of the strategic analysis. No words of appreciation or recognition for a son who had just ground his legion to dust for the Imperium's expansion. Just orders for the next deployment. This was how the Emperor managed his sons. Cold, distant, utilitarian to the point of cruelty. Hadrian considers the counterfactual. What if the Emperor had trusted his sons with the truth about Chios? What if he had explained the Webway project, shared his vision for humanity's future, allowed the Primarchs to understand the stakes? What if he had taken even a fraction of the time he spent on genetic engineering and applied it to actually building relationships with the demigod sons he created? The records suggest many Primarchs were desperate for this connection. Horus most of all. The Warmaster worshipped his father, sought his approval like a man dying of thirst seeks water. When the Emperor left for Terra without explanation, leaving Horus to lead the crusade alone, the wound was deep. Horus had given everything for the Great Crusade. He had earned the right to know why his father abandoned it, but the Emperor gave him nothing. No explanation, no trust. Just the burden of command and the silence of an absent father. Then, on Davin, when Chaos whispered to Horus in his fevered visions, it told him what the Emperor never would. It showed him the future the Emperor planned, a sterile empire ruled by bureaucrats and remembrancers, while the warriors who built it were cast aside, forgotten. It showed him a father who saw him not as a son, but as a tool, useful while needed, but ultimately disposable. Were these visions lies? Partially, yes. Chios is the father of lies, and truth twisted is often more poisonous than pure fabrication. But the core of the vision resonated because it reflected Horus's actual experience. The Emperor had used him, had given him no voice in the future being built, had treated him as a general rather than a son. When Horus made his choice on Davin, when he turned from loyalty to betrayal, was it entirely his decision? Or had the Emperor created the conditions that made that choice inevitable? Hadrian reads a fragment from a letter Horus sent to his brother Sanguinius early in the heresy, before the Blood Angels declared for the Loyalists. The letter is pleading, attempting to convince Sanguinius to join the rebellion. Brother, we have conquered the galaxy for him, and what is our reward? Distance. Silence. We are not sons to him. We are weapons, to be used and discarded when the killing is done. He builds his Imperium, but it will not be ours. We will be relics of a barbarous age, put aside when civilization no longer needs us. I will not accept this. I will not be cast aside by a father who never loved us, only used us. Sanguinius did not join Horus. His loyalty held. But even in his refusal, recorded in the response he sent, there is acknowledgement of Horus's pain. Brother, you are wrong about our father's intent, but I cannot deny the distance between us and him. I cannot deny the hurt we all feel. But the answer is not rebellion. It is faith that he knows more than we do, that his silence serves a purpose we cannot yet see. Faith, that word again. The Emperor demanded faith while forbidding religion. He required trust while offering none. He expected loyalty while providing no foundation for it except fear and duty. This was the flaw in the father. A brilliant strategist who failed to understand that managing demigod sons with human emotions required more than military hierarchy. A leader who created warriors capable of independent thought and then punished them for thinking. An architect who built beings with the capacity for doubt and betrayal, then created every condition necessary to trigger both. Hadrian sets down the data slate containing Horus's letter and looks up at the vaulted ceiling of the archive. Dust motes float in the filtered light, ancient particles suspended in recycled air. He thinks about the emperor, entombed on the golden throne for 10 millennia, kept barely alive by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day. Does he regret his choices? Does he understand now that a father who will not speak to his sons cannot be surprised when they stop listening? The thought is heretical. Hadrian banishes it, but not before acknowledging its truth. The third flaw is perhaps the most damning, because it was entirely of the emperor's making. The Primarchs themselves were fundamentally, catastrophically flawed. Not because of chaos corruption, not because of their scattered upbringing on distant worlds, but because of how they were designed. They were weapons. Weapons that could think, feel, suffer, and choose. This was the emperor's greatest mistake. Hadrian accesses the most restricted files in the archive, data that only librarians of his rank and clearance can view. These are the genetic analyses of the Primarchs, compiled by the Adeptus Mechanicus over millennia of study. Each Primarch was designed with specific traits, specific purposes. They were not meant to be well-rounded individuals. They were hyper-specialized tools of conquest. Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, is the clearest example of a design flaw that guaranteed tragedy. Angron was built to be a warrior of unmatched ferocity, a berserker whose rage could break any enemy. But the emperor found him not on a peaceful world where his nature could be channeled constructively. He found him as a slave gladiator, already broken by the butcher's nails, archaeotech implants hammered into his brain that turned pain into pleasure and forced him into states of murderous fury. The emperor could have removed the nails. He had the technology, the knowledge, the power to save his son from this torture, but he chose not to. The records from that time, sealed by the Mechanicus, but accessible to Hadrian through his clearance, are explicit. The emperor examined Angron, determined that removing the nails would kill him or fundamentally alter his personality, and decided that the benefit did not outweigh the risk. He left his son to suffer. He weaponized that suffering by placing Angron at the head of a legion and pointing him at the Imperium's enemies. Angron never forgave this. How could he? Every moment of his existence was agony, a torture device permanently embedded in his brain, forcing him to kill or go mad from pain. The emperor, who could move planets and create life itself, chose not to save him, chose to use him instead. Hadrian reads Angron's own words, shouted at Robot Guilliman during a confrontation before the heresy. "Your father made you to rule. He made me to kill. You get to build empires while I get to bleed for them. You are a son. I am a weapon. Never forget which of us knows our place." The tragedy is that Angron was right. The emperor did design him to kill. The nails simply made that design more efficient at the cost of Angron's sanity and humanity. When Angron turned to Chios, when he became a daemon prince of Khorne, was that corruption? Or was it the inevitable endpoint of a being designed for violence, tortured into permanent rage, and given no other purpose? Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, Primarch of the Night Lords, was equally doomed by design. Kurz was psychic, plagued by visions of the future, specifically visions of death and suffering. He saw the worst possible outcomes of every situation, experienced them as if they were already real, and could do nothing to prevent them. The emperor knew this. He knew his son was tormented by visions of inevitable horror, and he did nothing to help him. No psychic training to control the visions. No counseling to manage the psychological trauma. No acknowledgement that what Kurz experienced was real and terrible and needed addressing. Instead, The Emperor pointed curs at the Imperium's enemies and let him become a monster. The Night Lords specialized in terror tactics, in flaying civilians and broadcasting their screams to force compliance. Curs became what his visions showed him. Because no one ever offered him an alternative, a Hadrian finds a fragment of a conversation between Curs and his brother Rogel Dorn, recorded by a servitor during a war council. Curs is explaining his methods, his philosophy of fear. I have seen the future, Rogel. I have seen every possible future. In all of them, humanity is cruel and monstrous. In all of them, we are tyrants ruling over slaves. The only difference is whether we admit it or wear the mask of righteousness. I chose honesty. I am the monster our father made me to be, but at least I do not pretend otherwise. Dorn's response is cold, dismissive. You are broken, brother. Your visions have made you mad. Curs laughs, bitter and sharp. Mad, perhaps. But I see clearly. Our father made us weapons, then acts surprised when we cut. The pattern repeats across the Primarchs. Lorgar needed to worship. Magnus needed to know. Perturabo needed recognition. Mortarion needed freedom from tyranny. Fulgrim needed perfection. Each was designed with drives so powerful, they defined everything about them. And then those drives were either ignored or exploited by the Emperor. These were not bugs in the design. They were features. The Emperor wanted focused, effective tools of conquest. He got exactly what he designed. The problem was that he designed them with enough intelligence and self-awareness to question their purpose, enough emotion to be hurt by neglect, enough pride to rebel when disrespected. A sword does not choose when to swing, but the Primarchs were swords with souls, and souls can betray. Hadrian considers the loyalist Primarchs, those who remained faithful to the Emperor despite everything. Were they less flawed, or simply fortunate enough that their flaws aligned with loyalty? Robot Guilliman was designed to build and govern. His flaw was arrogance, a certainty that his way was the right way, but this flaw served the Imperium well. His need for order and structure made him the perfect administrator. Rogel Dorn was designed to defend and fortify. His flaw was stubbornness, an inability to admit weakness or accept criticism, but this made him an unbreakable shield for the Emperor. Lumen Russ was designed to be the Emperor's executioner, a savage warrior who could be pointed at a problem and trusted to destroy it utterly. His flaw was blind loyalty, an unwillingness to question orders even when those orders were monstrous. This made him the perfect tool. The loyalist Primarchs succeeded not because they were better designed, but because their flaws happened to serve the Emperor's purposes. The traitor Primarchs failed because their flaws made them unsuitable for the roles demanded of them, and the Emperor refused to adapt or acknowledge the mismatch. This is the core of the third flaw. The Emperor created beings capable of independent thought and emotion, gave them the power to reshape the galaxy, built them with psychological drives so intense they bordered on compulsion, and then expected them to function as obedient tools forever. It was a design guaranteed to fail. Hadrian finds one final document, a personal log entry from Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor and perhaps his only friend. The entry is dated shortly after the heresy began, when the scale of the betrayal was becoming clear. I told him this would happen. When he showed me the designs for the Primarchs, I warned him that making them so powerful, so independent, was dangerous. He said he needed weapons that could think, because the galaxy was too vast and complex for simple soldiers. I asked what would happen if those weapons turned on him. He said he would ensure their loyalty through genetic programming and careful management. I asked what would happen if that was not enough. He did not answer. I fear we have our answer now, written in the ashes of worlds and the blood of legions. He made sons when he needed slaves, and now he acts surprised when sons rebel. The log entry ends there. Malcador died during the heresy, his life force spent to maintain the Golden Throne. When the Emperor was wounded, he never saw the 10,000 years of suffering that followed his friend's ambition. Hadrian sits back in his chair. the weight of the evidence pressing down on him like the gravity of a neutron star. 3 flaws. The flaw in the design, an ideology that contradicted itself. The flaw in the father, a leader who could not lead. The flaw in the family, weapons too dangerous to wield safely. Each flaw alone might have been manageable. Together, they created a structure that was always going to collapse. The only question was when. So here is the answer to the question that haunts the Imperium. Was the Horus Heresy inevitable? Looking not at the moment Horus fell to Chaos, not at the battles or the betrayals, but at the foundation laid 10,000 years before. The evidence is overwhelming. Yes, it was inevitable. The heresy was not an accident. It was not bad luck or the unpredictable corruption of Chaos. It was the built-in failure state of the Imperial Dream. A dream flawed in its theory, its execution, and its very components. The Emperor built an atheistic empire on mythic violence. He demanded rational obedience from demigod sons. He kept in ignorance. He created weapons capable of choice and gave them every reason to choose betrayal. The specific details might have varied. Perhaps it would have been Magnus instead of Horus who turned first. Perhaps Lorgar would have led the rebellion instead of simply enabling it. Perhaps different legions would have fallen. Different worlds would have burned. But the betrayal itself was written into the design from the beginning. This is the ultimate Grimdark truth of the Imperium. 10,000 years of suffering, stagnation, and endless war were not caused by chaos, corruption, or alien invasion, or human weakness. They were caused by one man's ambition and his catastrophic failure to understand what he was building. The Emperor wanted to save humanity from the dark. He created the conditions that guaranteed humanity would drown in it. Hadrian stands, his armor servos whirring softly in the quiet of the archive. He will seal these records again, return them to the vaults where they belong. The Imperium does not benefit from this knowledge. The faithful need their myths, their belief in the Emperor's perfection, their certainty that the heresy was an external attack rather than an internal collapse. But Hadrian will remember. He will carry this knowledge forward, this understanding that the foundations of the Imperium were rotten from the start. Because if they do not learn from this, if they continue to worship the Emperor's choices as infallible rather than examining his mistakes, then they are doomed to repeat them. The galaxy burns because a father could not love his sons. It suffers because a visionary could not see his own blindness. It bleeds because weapons were given souls and then treated as tools. This is the truth of the Horus Heresy. Not a story of heroes and villains, but a tragedy of inevitability. The Emperor built a tower on sand and lies, staffed it with damaged demigods, and was shocked when it collapsed. Hadrian walks toward the vault exit, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Behind him, the archives sleep, filled with uncomfortable truths and questions that cannot be asked. Before him lies the Imperium, a galaxy-spanning empire built on the ruins of its founder's hubris. The sword was drawn in a quiet room 10,000 years ago. The bolter was chambered. A son looked at his father and made a choice. But it was never really a choice at all. The heresy was always going to happen. The only question left is whether the Imperium learned anything from it, or whether they will simply continue to venerate the mistakes that destroyed them, calling it faith, while the galaxy burns around them. Hadrian knows the answer. The Imperium learned nothing. They made the Emperor a god, the very thing he fought against. They turned his Imperial Truth into religious dogma. They repeated every mistake he made, but with less vision and more brutality. The tower is still standing, but it sways. The foundations are still rotten, still built on the same lies and contradictions. Another fall is not a question of if, but when. This is the price of inevitability. When you build an empire on flaws, when you create weapons that can think, when you demand faith while offering only lies, you do not get to be surprised when it all comes crashing down. The archives around Hadrian contain thousands of other documents, each adding another piece to the mosaic of failure. Reports from Legion commanders who saw the rot setting in years before Davin. psychological evaluations of Primarchs that were ignored by the Emperor and his advisors, strategic analyses warning that the Great Crusade's pace was unsustainable, that the legions were being pushed beyond their operational limits, that resentment was building like pressure in a sealed chamber. One document in particular catches Hadrian's attention as he prepares to leave. It is a letter from First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon of the Luna Wolves to his Primarch Horus, written 5 years before the heresy. Abaddon was already known for his ambition and his pride, but this letter reveals something deeper, a clarity of observation that makes his eventual fall even more tragic. My lord, I have concerns about the Crusade's direction. We have conquered thousands of worlds, but what are we building? The Emperor speaks of enlightenment and unity, yet we enforce compliance through violence. He speaks of reason, yet demands faith. He speaks of humanity's future, yet treats us as relics of its past. I do not question our duty or loyalty, but I wonder if our Father truly understands what He has created in us. We are not simply soldiers. We remember the worlds we burned, the civilians we killed in His name. We carry the weight of this crusade, and I fear that weight will eventually break us if He does not acknowledge it. Horus's response, attached to the file, is brief but telling. Your concerns are noted, Ezekiel, but we must trust that the Emperor sees further than we do. Our purpose is to serve, not to question. We are His instruments of will. The tragedy is that both of them were right and both were wrong. Abaddon was right that the weight would break them. Horus was right that they were instruments. But instruments break when misused, and the Emperor misused his sons catastrophically. Hadrian seals the archive and initiates the security protocols. The vault will remain locked for another century, unless another librarian with sufficient clearance seeks entry. The knowledge within will sleep, dangerous and necessary in equal measure. As he walks through the corridors of Macragge's fortress of Hera, passing brother space, Marines who go about their sacred duties with the certainty of faith, Hadrian contemplates the specific question that haunts him most. If the heresy was inevitable, if betrayal was built into the very foundations of the Imperium, then which Primarch was most inevitable to fall? The obvious answer is Horus. He was the War Master, the most favored son, and his fall created the conditions for the others to follow. But was his betrayal truly inevitable, or was he simply the catalyst for something that would have happened regardless? Hadrian considers each of the traitor Primarchs in turn, weighing their flaws against their circumstances. Angron was doomed from the moment the Emperor left the nails in his brain. His fall was not a question of if but when. The only surprise is that he lasted as long as he did before the pain and rage overwhelmed whatever loyalty he still possessed. But Angron's betrayal was passive in many ways. He did not choose chaos. He simply stopped resisting it, stopped caring about anything except the next battle, the next kill that would briefly ease the agony in his skull. His inevitability was chemical, neurological, a matter of pain receptors and corrupted neurons. Tragic, but perhaps not the most conceptually inevitable. Conrad Kurz saw his own betrayal before it happened. He experienced it in visions that tormented him throughout his life. In a sense, his fall was the most inevitable because he knew it was coming and could do nothing to prevent it. But knowing the future does not necessarily mean it is fixed. Kurz could have chosen differently at key moments, could have sought help from his brothers or his father. His inevitability was psychological, a self-fulfilling prophecy born of despair and nihilism. Mortarion, the Death Lord, fell because he hated tyrants, and the Emperor was the greatest tyrant in human history. But Mortarion's hatred was more complicated than simple rebellion. He hated his adoptive father on Barbarous, the necromancer who ruled through fear and poison. When the Emperor arrived and killed the necromancer, before Mortarion could, it robbed him of his victory, his chance to prove he could overcome tyranny through his own strength. The Emperor became just another tyrant in Mortarion's eyes, perhaps even worse, because he claimed to offer freedom while demanding total obedience. Hadrian finds a recording of a conversation between Mortarion and Jagatai Khan, the great Khan of the White Scars, held shortly before the heresy. Khan had always been independent, resisting full integration into the imperial hierarchy, and Mortarion sought his perspective. "You see it too, do you not?" Mortarion asked. "The cage he has built for us. Gilded, certainly. Vast beyond measure. But a cage nonetheless. We are told we fight for humanity's freedom, yet we are less free than the mortals we liberate. We cannot question, cannot choose, cannot be anything except what he designed us to be." Khan's response was measured, thoughtful. "Freedom is a complicated thing, brother. Is a man free if he has choices but lacks the wisdom to choose well? Is a warrior free if he can go anywhere but has nowhere he truly belongs? The emperor offers purpose. Many would say that is worth more than freedom. Many would be slaves calling their chains security." Mortarion replied. The conversation devolved into philosophical debate, but the core of Mortarion's position was clear. He fell not because of Chaos corruption initially, but because he could not accept being ruled by anyone, even a father who claimed to have humanity's best interests at heart. His rebellion was ideological, principled in its own twisted way. He chose damnation because he believed it was more honest than the emperor's vision of enlightenment through tyranny. Fulgrim, the Phoenician, fell to pride and the pursuit of perfection. His legion, the emperor's children, was small and nearly destroyed early in the crusade. Fulgrim rebuilt them through perfectionism taken to obsessive extremes. Every battle had to be flawless. Every campaign had to demonstrate mastery. Every action had to prove that the emperor's children were worthy of their name. But perfection is impossible, and the pursuit of it is madness. When Fulgrim encountered the Chaos artifact on Laren, when he took the daemon-possessed sword despite warnings from his own warriors, it was not corruption that led him astray. It was the belief that he could master even this, could bend even demonic power to his will through sheer perfection of technique. His fall was vanity's logical conclusion. He was designed to seek perfection, given no guidance on what perfection meant or how to achieve it, and inevitably concluded that perfection required transcending all limits, even the limits of sanity and morality. Perturbo's fall might be the most tragic because it was so entirely preventable. He was a genius, loyal to a fault, dedicated to the Imperium despite receiving nothing but grinding deployments and no recognition. He destroyed his own home world of Olympia when it rebelled, executing his own people to prove his loyalty to the Emperor. The Emperor's response was silence, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice, no understanding of the psychological toll, just more orders, more sieges, more thankless deployments, while legions like the Imperial Fists were celebrated for doing the same work with less efficiency. Perturbo fell because he was never appreciated. His bitterness, carefully cultivated over decades of neglect, made him vulnerable to Horus's promises of recognition and respect. When he finally turned, it was not out of ambition or corruption, but exhaustion. He was simply tired of being used. Magnus the Red is perhaps the most intellectually inevitable traitor. He was designed to understand the warp, to push the boundaries of psychic knowledge, and then forbidden from doing exactly that. The Emperor told him the warp was dangerous but refused to explain why. Told him sorcery was forbidden but offered no distinction between sorcery and sanctioned psychic powers. Told him to trust blindly in doctrines that contradicted everything Magnus's own research revealed. For a being designed to seek knowledge above all else, this was torture worse than Angron's nails. Magnus broke not because he was weak, but because he was exactly what he was designed to be. A scholar who could not stop seeking truth, even when that truth led into damnation. Lorgar, however, stands as perhaps the most inevitable traitor of all. Not because he was weak, not because he was damaged like Angron or tormented like Kurz, but because his fall was written into his genetic code with absolute clarity. Lorgar was designed to have faith, not as a personality trait or a psychological tendency, but as a fundamental aspect of his being. He needed to worship the way a human needs to breathe. When the emperor crushed his faith at Monarchia, when he destroyed a city that worshipped him and forced Lorgar to kneel in the ashes, he created a void that had to be filled. Hadrian accesses one final document, a psychologist report commissioned by Malchidor the Sigillite after Monarchia. The psychologist, a mortal named Dr. Varain Moss, had been asked to evaluate Lorgar's mental state and predict how he would respond to the emperor's punishment. The report is clinical, precise, and damning in its accuracy. Subject: Lorgar demonstrates psychological patterns consistent with extreme need for external validation through faith-based frameworks. His identity is entirely constructed around devotion to a higher power. The emperor's rejection at Monarchia has not eliminated this need, merely redirected it into a state of seeking. Subject will inevitably find a new object of worship. The only questions are what he will worship and how much damage he will cause in the process of finding it. Dr. Moss recommended immediate intervention, psychotherapy, possibly genetic recalibration to reduce the faith need mechanism. The recommendations were ignored. Malchidor filed the report and took no action. The emperor, when informed, stated that Lorgar would adapt or be replaced. Lorgar adapted. He found gods who welcomed worship. He found powers that answered prayers. He found chaos. 43 years after Monarchia, Lorgar's word-bearers were the most devout chaos worshippers in the galaxy. He had written the Book of Lorgar, a religious text that corrupted everything it touched. He had converted Horus to chaos worship on Davin. He had orchestrated the heresy's spiritual foundations, turning a political rebellion into a religious crusade, all because the emperor destroyed his faith and offered no alternative except a void that could not be sustained. Lorgar's fall was inevitable because he was designed with a need that could not be eliminated, only redirected. When the emperor destroyed the object of that need, he guaranteed Lorgar would find something else to worship. That it was chaos rather than something else was perhaps chance. That Lorgar would worship something was certainty. This makes Lorgar the most inevitable traitor. Not the first to fall, not the most powerful, but the one whose betrayal was most clearly written into his design. He was a weapon built to worship, aimed at enemies, and shocked when he found gods willing to accept his devotion. Hadrian emerges from the fortress into Macrage's filtered sunlight. The sky above him a carefully maintained blue that it exists only because of terraforming technology. The world is perfect, orderly, a monument to Robout Guilliman's vision of what the Imperium could be. But even here, in this perfect world, the flaws are visible if you know where to look. The servitors that maintain the infrastructure are lobotomized criminals and debtors, their humanity stripped away to create biological machines. The tithe that Macrage pays to the Imperium demands millions of young men and women be shipped off-world every year to die in wars they do not understand. The peace and order are maintained through surveillance, indoctrination, and the ever-present threat of Adeptus Arbit's violence against dissent. This is the best the Imperium can offer. A beautiful world where everyone knows their place, where order is absolute, where questioning is heresy. It is the Emperor's vision made manifest, and it is built on the same flaws that caused the heresy. Hadrian wonders if Robout Guilliman, should he ever awaken from his stasis, would see these flaws. Would the Primarch who wrote the Codex Astartes, who built Ultramar into a shining example of imperial governance, recognize that he was simply making the same mistakes the Emperor made, just more efficiently? The thought is dangerous, bordering on heretical. Hadrian walks toward his quarters, passing statues of heroes who died in the heresy, memorials to battles that decided the fate of the galaxy. Each statue tells a story of loyalty and sacrifice. None of them tell the story of why the sacrifice was necessary in the first place. Because to tell that story, to truly examine why the heresy happened, would require admitting that the Emperor was fallible, that his grand design was flawed. that the Imperium is built on mistakes so fundamental that acknowledging them would shake the entire structure. Better to blame Chios. Better to say that Daemon's corrupted loyal sons, that external forces broke what was perfect. Better to maintain the myth than face the truth. But myths do not keep the Imperium safe. Understanding does. And if the Imperium continues to refuse to understand why the heresy happened, continues to venerate the mistakes that caused it, then another fall is inevitable. The galaxy is vast. The Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds. But empires that do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and the Imperium's history is written in the ashes of its own hubris. Hadrian reaches his cell, a sparse room with a bed, a desk, and shelves of forbidden books he maintains in his capacity as librarian. He sits at the desk and begins to write his own analysis, his own conclusions drawn from the archives. His report will be filed with the librarius, sealed and stored for future librarians to read. Perhaps in another century, another scholar will access these same archives, read these same terrible truths, and come to the same conclusions. The heresy was inevitable, not because chaos was too powerful, not because humanity was too weak, but because the emperor built a dream on lies and expected it to stand forever. He created an atheist empire through demigod worship. He demanded reason while enforcing faith. He built weapons that could think, and then punished them for questioning. Every single choice he made created the conditions for betrayal. The specific traitors might have varied. Perhaps in another timeline it was Perturabo who turned first, or Magnus, or even one of the lost Primarchs whose records are completely expunged. But traitors there would be, because the design guaranteed it. 10,000 years later, humanity suffers under the weight of the Emperor's mistakes. The Imperium is stagnant, brutal, superstitious in ways that would have horrified the Emperor during his mortal life. They made him into the very thing he fought against, a god demanding absolute faith, and they learned nothing from the heresy except that questioning is dangerous and loyalty must be absolute. This is the price humanity pays for inevitability. When your empire's founding moment is a catastrophic failure, every day after is borrowed time. The tower still stands, but it sways with every passing century. The foundation is still rotten, still built on contradictions and lies. Another betrayal will come, perhaps not from the Primarchs, most of whom are dead or ascended or missing. Perhaps from within the institutions that maintain the Imperium's corpse. The Inquisition, the Mechanicus, the High Lords of Terra, each one growing more corrupt, more disconnected from the original vision, more concerned with power than purpose. Or perhaps the next betrayal will come from the Emperor himself, should he ever wake from his 10,000-year dream. What will he think of the Imperium that worships him as a god? What will he say when he sees that every mistake he made has been amplified 1,000-fold, that his vision of rational enlightenment became theocratic tyranny? Will he acknowledge his failures, or will he repeat them? Because that is all he knows how to do. Hadrian finishes his report with a final paragraph, a conclusion that he knows will be controversial if anyone besides future librarians ever reads it. The Horus Heresy teaches us that empires built on flaws will fail, that fathers who do not love their sons will lose them, that weapons given souls will eventually refuse to be wielded. The Imperium has learned none of these lessons. We repeat the Emperor's mistakes daily, calling it loyalty, calling it faith, calling it necessity, until we acknowledge the flaws in our foundation, until we admit that the Emperor was fallible and his design was broken. We are simply waiting for the next inevitable collapse. The tower still stands, but towers built on sand eventually fall. The only question is when. He seals the report and files it in the librarius archive system. It will sleep there, like the documents he studied, waiting for someone to read it and understand. Outside his window, Macrage's perfect sun sets over perfect cities filled with imperfect people, living under an imperfect empire that refuses to acknowledge its imperfection. The galaxy burns. It has burned for 10,000 years. It will continue burning until someone, somewhere, has the courage to admit why it burns. The heresy was inevitable. The suffering that followed was inevitable. And the next catastrophe, whatever form it takes, will be inevitable too. Because inevitability is what happens when you build on lies and expect truth to emerge. When you create weapons and expect them to be suns. When you demand faith and offer only distance. The Emperor made his choices. The galaxy pays the price. And in the quiet of a librarian's cell on a perfect world, one space marine knows the truth that the Imperium refuses to see. The betrayal began not on Davin, not in the moment Horus turned. It began in a laboratory on Terra, in the mind of a man who thought he could create perfect weapons without creating perfect conditions for those weapons to turn against him. It began with the Emperor's hubris. It ended with the galaxy's damnation. And no amount of faith, no amount of worship, no amount of sacrifice will change the fact that it was always going to happen exactly as it did. The sword was drawn. The bolter was chambered. A son looked at his father, and the choice, terrible and inevitable, was made, not because of chaos, not because of weakness, but because the Emperor built an empire that could only ever fail, staffed it with sons designed to betray him, and acted surprised when they did exactly what their nature demanded. This is the truth of the Horus Heresy. This is the truth the Imperium cannot acknowledge. This is the truth that will destroy them again, and again, and again, until they finally learn. But they will not learn. They cannot learn, because learning would require admitting that the Emperor was wrong. And in the Imperium of the 41st millennium, that admission is the only heresy that cannot be forgiven. So the galaxy burns, and it will continue to burn, and somewhere in the ashes, someone will ask the same question Hadrian asked today. Was the betrayal inevitable? And the answer, terrible and true, will always be the same. Yes, it was always going to happen. The only question that remains is which Primarch was most doomed by design, most inevitable in their betrayal, most perfectly crafted to fail. Hadrian believes it was Lorgar. Others might argue for Angron, for Magnus, for any of the fallen sons whose flaws made their corruption a mathematical certainty. But the answer does not matter as much as the acknowledgement that there is an answer, that the heresy was not random chance or external corruption, but internal failure written into the genetic code of the Imperium itself. This acknowledgement is heresy in the current age, but it is also truth, and truth, in the grim darkness of the far future, is the rarest commodity of all. Hadrian sleeps that night with the weight of terrible knowledge pressing on his heart. He dreams of the Emperor, not as a god, but as a man, standing in his laboratory surrounded by genetic tanks containing his unborn sons. In the dream, the Emperor knows. He sees the future, sees the betrayal, sees the 10,000 years of suffering his choices will cause. And he proceeds anyway, because he believes he has no choice, that this is the only path forward, that the potential rewards justify the certain costs. In the dream, Hadrian wants to scream at him, to warn him, to beg him to make different choices, but the Emperor cannot hear him. The Emperor is trapped in his own vision, his own certainty, his own inability to see the flaws in his design. And so the Primarchs are created, and so they are scattered, and so they are found and given legions and sent to conquer the galaxy. And so, inevitably, some of them turn. The dream ends with the sound of a sword being drawn, a bolter round being chambered. The greatest war in history begins with a choice. But it was never really a choice at all.